Are we on Zoom? Yep. Okay, great. Thanks very much. So I'm going to talk about the work of the Agri-Food for Net Zero network a little bit, and then talk about some work that we've been doing developing future scenarios, pictures of the future in 2050 to help stimulate thinking and sort of break out of business as usual thinking. And I think that might be helpful just to sort of put into context this stuff that we're thinking about around methane and the livestock sector in the context of the wider agri-food challenges as we move to a net zero UK. So that's the plan. I can't remember if well, screen sharing has stopped. Sorry.
You got it? Which one is it? Is it this one?
Yeah.
Does that work?
I click to move the pen. Okay, right. Okay, so first thing, global agri-food system emissions are rising. They're on a rising trajectory. This is some work done for the European Commission looking at all greenhouse gas emissions and separating out those that are just from the food sector. That's agriculture and food processing and retailing. So we're on a rising trajectory globally. In the UK, emissions are coming down from the agri-food system, but they're not coming down at a steep enough trajectory to enable us to get to a net zero UK by 2050. So the challenge is from this point on to 2050 to bring this trajectory more steeply downwards. That's the UK agri-food system as a whole, agriculture and food processing and retailing and the associated emissions. If we take just the agriculture sector, then there has been a reduction in emissions since 1990, but most of the reduction was in the early part of that period. And really from the last 10, 15 years or so, you could say emissions have been generally sort of flatlining. They've bobbled up and down a little bit. So it's in that context that UKRI, the umbrella organisation for the research councils, funded this Network Plus to bring people together across the different research council remits, so physical sciences, biological sciences, social sciences, environmental sciences, and to talk with stakeholders and think through where the big research challenges, what are the big research gaps, to help inform the research councils thinking about their investments. Collectively, I think the research councils spend about £8 billion a year on all research, and the food system and net zero are an increasingly sort of prominent part of their priorities. But what within that should be the areas of sort of primary focus. So we've got about over 1,700 members at the moment. We've been going for about 18 months. Members are academics and researchers in research institutes, but also from third sector organizations, companies, farmers, farmer groups, and so on. Alongside the sort of core research that we do as an academic team running the network, we run online events. We've got a program of webinars once a month. You might have some of you might have seen some of those. We did one on methane a short while back, and we're producing briefings, and we also fund research projects. We did a call for research projects last year, and we've got another and to win money, the project needs to be led by someone based in a higher education institution, but working in partnership with a non-academic partner. So if there's anyone here on the academic side, for example, or online following, who's interested in the methane and the manure management question, I have been approached by some companies that are interested in bidding and developing projects. So we hope that in that competition there'll be people with project ideas around the methane and manure management question, amongst many other topics as well. The project overall, the network, is a £5 million investment, and it's going to run until the end of 2025 in the first instance. So I'm one of the co-leads. Angelina is the PI for the project. Angelina's here, gives a wave. And Jez is the Knowledge Exchange Fellow and helps run all the webinars. And this is the executive team: Tim Benton, who's based at the University of Leeds and at Chatham House, some of you might know, and Sarah Bridle at the University of York, and Stefan Kapinski at the University of Leeds as well. We have a set of champions who help us with our work, and Amy's here. So wave, Amy. It's one of our champions. And I think we've got 6 champions in all for this year. They help convene activities and drive some of our knowledge exchange work forwards. It's quite a good network of academic institutions that are involved in the running of the network. We're UK wide, so we have partners in Northern Ireland and Scotland and Wales, as well as different regions of England. So the context of the work is about the net zero challenge. The legal statutory commitment to get to a net zero UK was signed off in June 2019, I think. It was just in the last few weeks of Theresa May's premiere. So we're coming up to the 5th anniversary of signing the UK statutory commitment to net zero by 2050, which means we're about 13% of the way there, I think, through that transition. Doesn't time fly? This report from the Climate Change Committee has been really helpful in providing some sort of architecture around the challenge. That was published in January 2020, so soon after the net zero commitment and just ahead of the 6th carbon budget, which came out later in 2020. And what that does is it rather helpfully sort of delineates these main areas of challenge, or questions of dietary change, land use change, and changing farming practices. After the Climate Change Committee report, the Henry Dimbleby review subsequently produced quite a nice analysis as well, along similar lines, but about the broader questions of the food system. So if we take the 6th carbon budget, which was published towards the end of 2020, and the Climate Change Committee is in the process of producing the 7th carbon budget, which will be published in February 2025. This is the most sort of authoritative, independent sort of statement on a roadmap to net zero UK. But it's advice. It's not absolutely hardwired into government policy, but it is the advice of the statutory advisor. And so this is probably the most authoritative, independent picture of that transition and the kind of scale of it. So I won't go through all of this data in detail, and the presentation will be posted up, but it talks about changes in food consumption, a 20% drop in meat and dairy by 2035, and a further 15% drop in meat consumption by 2050. So we're talking about around about a third reduction in meat and dairy by 50. That's not just about the trying to reduce the emissions from the production and from the animals. It's also about the need to have a smaller land footprint around livestock farming to free up land for other uses. And probably that sort of land squeeze driver is an even stronger driver than the reducing livestock numbers to reduce emissions from the livestock, because there are other ways of reducing total emissions from livestock other than just reducing the numbers. a whole set of discussions about different farming practices in arable agriculture, around energy use in agriculture, and around livestock farming as well, which we're talking about today. And then on land, there's some quite big challenges around land use change to get to net zero. Planting trees and growing energy crops is quite a weighty factor in the net zero transition. So our woodland cover is about 13% at the moment. According to the Climate Change Committee, it would need to expand to about 17 or 18% by 2050 to be sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as part of the overall net zero calculations. So the sixth carbon budget suggests that around a third of agricultural land from 2020, around a third of that area would need to be released for other uses. This pie chart sums up where the emissions reductions are to come from. And the key point here is just the significance of afforestation and growing energy crops, which is over 2/3 of the energy of the emissions reduction comes from that land use change. So in that context, we've been having lots of workshops like this and online meetings and discussions with research institutes and research teams and stakeholders. And some of the issues that emerge from all of that in thinking about what the big dilemmas, the big thorny issues, the unresolved questions in the agri-food transition, these would be what I would distill out as some of the biggest ones. First one is actually about the sort of way that we conceptualize food production and the agricultural industry in the UK, but in other nations as well. And there's a tension between thinking about UK food production as the provider of UK food for consumption. So our domestic agriculture is about our domestic food demands. And the idea of agriculture in a much more international and traded and globalized context where food is flowing in and out, and agriculture is kind of like other sectors in that it ought to be free to trade, and we're growing food for the export market as well as for domestic consumption, and we're certainly importing food for consumption. So, is agriculture just like producing widgets and other sort of manufacturing sectors, or is there something rather distinctive about domestic food consumption needs as a strategic sort of concern of the nation, which might make the treatment of agriculture and imports and exports rather different? So that's one. This land squeeze question is exercising a lot of minds and a lot of research questions around it. So the Royal Society produced a report which suggested that our commitments, what we need land for, when you sort of total them all up, it looks like we need a load more extra land that we don't have. Land is finite in the UK, but when you look at population growth, and then you look at food production needs and carbon sequestration and nature recovery and biodiversity targets and recreation and all of the other demands on land, then there's not going to be enough land. So there's a squeeze, and we have to think about how we reconcile those competing pressures. There is the question of the footprint or the hoofprint of animal agriculture. So that's not just the land that is occupied with the animals grazing on it, but also the arable land, which is growing animal feed, both for cattle, but also for pigs and poultry. So quite significant part of UK agricultural land use is orientated to animals, not just the livestock farms, but part of the arable land as well. Questions about mixed farming and circular systems, and might we be able to reduce emissions by having livestock and arable crops much more closer together and operating in harmony, and trying to develop a sort of circular economy in an agricultural context? There's a big debate about dietary change, and of course there's a very important question of what all this means for the livelihoods of those involved in agricultural production, but also particularly livestock farmers who make up the majority of the number of people employed in agriculture, and are understandably concerned about how they're going to make a living and how this transformation, this transition to a net zero world is going to impact upon their livelihoods. So in that context, we did some work on developing some plausible futures. I'm going to talk about that rather quickly, I think, because I've taken up 15 minutes. Plausible futures. So here we are now on the left, and we trundle along to 2050, and there could be a wide range of possible futures. So that's the blue. And there's a sort of a sense of a group of probable futures, which are the ones in the middle. And we might have views on what would be a preferable future, which doesn't quite map onto exactly what a probable future is. And the inner, the circle, which is kind of pinky color, is about plausible futures. So not just the most probable future, but what might be a range of possible or more plausible futures by 2050. So this was an exercise in trying to imagine what those futures would look like, and bring in a set of concerns from outside of the agri-food sector. We had 3 workshops last spring. We had people from Ministry of Defence and diplomatic services, international banking, United Nations. We had a lot of, we convened it at Chatham House, and there was a lot of people who didn't have much to do with the food system, but they sort of live and breathe geopolitics. And a set of critical uncertainties emerged around what's going to be the nature of geopolitics, and particularly around global stability, questions about how the economy might work, and about how demand might play out, whether we might move to a more stronger sort of sense of sustainable ethics driving consumption. So we developed these 4 scenarios. I'm going to run through them very quickly now and then try and finish on time. Build back fast again, circular worlds, self-sufficiency, and the right to food. Build back fast again. I won't go through all the text, but this is essentially business as usual, trundled forward, which is that we stagger from crisis to crisis, and we're perpetually in the mode of either in a crisis or recovering from a crisis. So this is sort of typical of the last 10, 15 years, where we've been very preoccupied with economic growth as a result of a shock to the system, whether it be the first financial crisis, Brexit, COVID, Ukraine. We're not quite getting through the turbulence after those crises before another crisis hits us. So this is the kind of current geopolitical scene rolled forward. This is one where we have the emergence of a stronger sort of sense of shared values, driven by perhaps people that might be in their teens and 20s and 30s now, becoming demographically a sort of dominant part of running the economy and running society and politics, perhaps bringing some change, social and political values. Here, agriculture, perhaps in the UK, might produce less, but it'd be more diverse. Food might be a bit more expensive, less meat consumption, fewer livestock, a sense of a more cooperative approach to trade. So that's a kind of utopian kind of world around circularity. Scenario C, self-sufficiency for security. Here, security becomes a much stronger influence on international geopolitics and on the national political context for thinking about the agri-food system. It's a fractured, multipolar world. There's much more concern about conflict, and security of supply becomes the dominant driver. So you end up with a more kind of circular style of economy, but it's born out of necessity to save resources. Food consumption becomes more regionalized, more seasonal. There's less meat consumption in this scenario as well. Trade declines. You have more green fertilizers, and some grazing land is abandoned. So here, self-sufficiency for security is the sort of dominant feeling. And third one, the right to food. this is one where we have a new sort of social deal. There's more interest in concepts like universal basic income and rights to access to affordable food that's sufficiently nutritious. Technology is quite important in this one. Mixed economy of food production, decline in livestock in this one as well, more focus on fruit and vegetables. Agriculture is primarily sustainably intensive. Oh, did I miss one? I did them all. So these are tools in which organizations can think about the future in a way that just broadens out from the future will just be an extrapolation of the last 5 or 10 years to sort of broaden the range of plausible futures. So it's been taken up by a few organizations that are thinking about some of the nuts and bolts issues around the agri-food system, but in the context of shifting geopolitical waters. So just to draw some concluding points, and hopefully that's some food for thought as we move into looking at some of the initiatives in the subsequent presentations. You can see that in the net zero transition in the agri-food system, there's a sort of tension between technologies and techno-fix type solutions and some of these broader questions of social and systemic change. And certainly that's what's happening amongst researchers, seeing a lot more interest in system change, and that takes you into questions of social science as well as technology. A cleavage around the role of government versus other kinds of forces that might shape the world that we're in. And I think some people feel government might be a key agent, and other people feel that the role of government is overplayed and overimagined, and actually there are much stronger forces shaping the way the world will be. But these scenarios can be used to help imagine what those different, the playing out of those forces in different ways might mean for the food system. On the presentation, I've put up some references like a good lecturer for students. So these are some of the other scenarios that are available out there. And if you don't want to read all of those, you could read my book, which is a bit of a synthesis. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Neil. That was really interesting, and I think the scenario is a really good way of trying to imagine how the future might be. Do you have some questions from the audience in the room?
When people understand partial, the way that I see it is that cow absorbs about 70% of the energy within the pasture. It's fed, but stays in the soil. So already in my mind, 30% of pasture is already surplus energy which you could use, and that's land that's not been recognised in those calculations. That would be a fair comment.
So the question, gosh, I'll try and repeat the question. So the question is that the cow is...
That's 70%.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's 30% of the land is pasture.
Yeah, so the cow, 70%. Yeah. So the question from Chris is that if the cow absorbs 70% of the energy that it eats, then 30% of that ends up in the slurry lagoon. How is that accounted for in your scenarios?
It isn't in our scenarios. So our scenarios were imagined, and they're, you're thinking about the climate change committees. Yeah. So you come at this from energy, Chris, and I think of land as hectares. So I haven't thought of it from that perspective. But I think the land challenge is about all of the different uses. Some of it is about needing to mitigate emissions to get to net zero. That needs land for planting trees and growing energy crops to feed into power stations, to do carbon capture and storage. And the other uses are around, we're going to have probably 10% more population in 2050. I think at least 10% more.
the past, and it's like pathways.
Yeah. So your argument would be if you capture and process the methane from the slurry stores, that reduces the pressure to grow energy crops, and you could get to net zero without that land use change. Yes, that's interesting. I haven't thought of that before. That is more grist to the mill for doing research on methane coming off of slurry pits and capturing it. As another benefit that we hadn't thought of, that it could potentially ease the pressure, the land use pressure. But that's some more sums we could do. Look forward to that. Yeah.
Is there an online question we can take? We just really have time for one more. One.
I think again, it's related to COVID as a trigger. I think this is more relevant to the online question. COVID triggered the circular transition. It doesn't learn anything that's something from that. Is that something? It is, you know, that kickstarts a lot of things and innovation. Is that something that we can
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So the question is about COVID and what that means for the transition. So that's quite interesting. The book that I put up, I wrote 2021 to 2022. In fact, we were in a lockdown when I started writing it, and at that time I was sort of thinking, well, this is I'd been helping run the university and looking after all the students, so it's quite a headache, COVID. But coming out of that, it was like, wow, that's been quite interesting. COVID sort of provides a set of lessons for how we think about this transition, because the transition is quite eye-watering in terms of the amount of change. I mean, it's quite, to my mind, quite challenging in terms of how does that change get orchestrated and organized? What's the role of markets? What's the role of companies? What's the role of government? And I thought that COVID might provide an opportunity to look at all of those questions anew, because there'd been an experience which had unsettled the sort of way that we organize ourselves, and there'd had to be a whole load of sort of social compromises and restrictions and a lot of regulation on everyday life. I mean, what you could argue that the climate crisis is a sort of COVID thing, but in slower motion. But the response isn't quite as rapid. I think probably 2 or 3 years later, I wonder whether actually the COVID experience is sort of quite rapidly fading in memory, and we've settled back to something closer to a mindset pre-COVID of how you organize and orchestrate change. But I don't know. We will have to see. That's the best I can do on answering that one. I hope that gets somewhere towards answering it.
Thank you.